Hi everyone, welcome to the class for this week. Apologies I couldn't make the live lecture today. I have an appointment that I can't miss. So I've recorded this video to introduce you to the topics that you're going to see in this week's lab. So first off, we're going to talk about the dashboard controller. We're going to make some changes to the dashboard controller in this week's lab. But first we'll review what we have so far. The change we're going to make this week is to change it so that it no longer displays all of the playlists and the songs directly on the dashboard, but instead it will show the title of the playlist on the dashboard as well as its duration, and we'll also have a link then, as you see there, which will allow us to click and view the contents of this individual playlist. So on the dashboard we'll just show the titles, and then when we click view for, let's say, Beethoven sonatas, we want to see all the songs that belong to just that playlist. So I suppose effectively we're splitting our current structure into a dashboard and a playlist view. Okay, so first of all, to go over the dashboard controller that we have so far. So the code that's in the dashboard controller at the moment, the first line tells it that we want to use the strict mode of JavaScript. Strict mode in JavaScript just means that you, for example, you can't use a variable before you declare it and things like that. So it's just a stricter interpretation of the JavaScript language. Okay, next then we were importing the logger, the error logger that we're using, and the playlist store, which is where our playlists are coming from. Next then we're creating our dashboard object, and within that the index method, which is responsible for creating the dashboard view whenever we get a request from the user. In here then we've included the logger.info message, so we can see that this method is actually being called. Next then we're creating the view data object and passing through in that object any information that we want to display on the dashboard. So at the moment that's the title of the page and also the playlists as well. The playlists are coming from our playlist store. And another message here so we can keep track of what's going on. This part here lets us check that the playlists have successfully been fetched from the playlist store. So when we say view data.playlists here, it's going to mean the playlists in this view data object that we hopefully just got from the playlist store. So we should be able to see in our log then if we have actually got those playlists. And last couple of lines then, response.render, which renders it to the dashboard view. This part here, you may remember, is going to tell the controller that it should look for a file called dashboard. So it's going to look in the views folder for a file called dashboard, and our file there is called dashboard.hps. And through to that view, it's passing the view data object that we just created with the title and the playlist and so on as well. And finally, we're exporting the dashboard object so that it can be used in other places like the router, for example. Okay, so that's a recap of what we have there so far. And now, like I said, we're going to revise it now so that instead of showing all the playlists on the dashboard, we're just going to show the title of each playlist along with a link. And when we click on that link, we then should be brought to a different view called playlist, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a while. That playlist view is going to display all the songs within the playlist when we click on that link. So to do this, we're going to also need to make some changes to our dashboard HBS view. So in here, this is the code that we have so far. We are going through each of the playlists, and for each one we're including a H2 header and a title for the playlist, and we're also including a list songs partial for each one. You may remember from the previous lab that the list songs partial is where we create the table for each playlist. Okay, so at this stage now, we're going to remove that list songs partial. We'll use that eventually in the playlist view. And instead, we're going to restructure our dashboard HBS view so that it just shows a link that looks like this to get into the playlist. Okay, you can see here we've also got the duration of the playlist. And here we've got a link that will let us view the playlist once we click on it. This link looks a little bit different to some of the other ones that we've seen so far. So let's say the dashboard link, for example, you've seen that that is just /dashboard. With this playlist link, because we have multiple different playlists, we are also going to give it a second value, which is ID. And you can see here ID is a handlebars expression. So that means it's going to be filled in with the current ID of the playlist, whatever that is. So for example, for the first playlist, the link will be /playlist/01, assuming that's what your ID is for the first playlist. And for the second one, it would be playlist/02 and so on. So each playlist will have a unique link based on its ID. Okay, and that's the link then that we'll be clicking to get in to view that playlist. We will also add a new route to support that. When you, in the lab this week, when you create this new dashboard view, the link won't work straight away until you actually set up the rest of the stuff. So far you'll just have the link, and when you click on it, you'll see this message that says cannot get playlist 01 or whatever ID of the playlist that you've clicked on. So next we're going to talk about the other things we need to do to create this new playlist view, including a new route and a new controller and so on as well. So in this second set of slides, I'm going to talk about the playlist controller. But just before I do that, I want to just switch over to Glitch for a second and just show you what the links on the dashboard are going to look like, just so that you kind of understand that before we get into talking about the playlist view. So like we spoke about in the last lecture, in the last set of slides, we're restructuring the dashboard so that it will look like this. So we just see the title for each of our playlists, and we also see a link to get into the playlist. Eventually in one of the exercises, you're going to restyle that link so that it looks like this little folder icon instead. So this is what's going to actually bring us into a playlist, as you see here. We also have links to delete the playlists, and I'll talk about that functionality in a little while. But before we go into that, I'm just going to go and view the source of this page. Okay, and just zoom in a little bit here. So you can see here, this is the rendered HTML for those playlist links. And here you can see what I was talking about with the playlist IDs being picked up. So in our dashboard HBS view, actually, sorry, that's been moved into a list partials, list playlist partial, and you'll do that in the lab as well. You can see here, this is the playlist ID being included, like we spoke about in the previous set of slides. So that's going to plug in the ID of the current playlist as it goes through each one. So for the first one, it'll be 01, for the second one, 02, and the third one, 03, and so on. And then here, when that gets rendered, it will come out looking like this. Okay, so like I said, playlist /01 for my first playlist, playlist 02 for the second, 03 for the third, and so on. And this is why, as one of the exercises last week, we got you to add in IDs, because now we're going to rely on those IDs to differentiate our playlists from one another, and also to use as part of this link here when we want to click to see, for example, just this Sonatas playlist. Okay, so that's what those links will look like. And to go back now then to the playlist controller and talk about that next. So what we need to do next is to create another view for when we click on the view on the dashboard to bring us in to show us that individual playlist. So whenever we want to add a new view, there's a few things that we need to include. And you saw some of these in an exercise a couple of weeks ago when you created the About view yourselves. You would have created the view and also added a root and added an About controller as well. Here there's one extra step, which is including the playlist in the playlist store model. But yeah, so 4 things you'll need to do to include the new view. Include the root to direct the app to the correct place when we click on the view to see the playlist. We'll also add a playlist controller, playlist.js, and that will be responsible for creating the playlist view. We will also add a new method in the playlist store model to show us just that one playlist as opposed to showing all the playlists. And lastly, we'll create the view itself that will output and display the correct playlist. Okay, so first of all, we just had a look at that link there. You may remember from when we spoke about the request response lifecycle in the app that the first thing to happen really is when the user clicks on the link to request to see that playlist. So the link that they're clicking on, we saw there a second ago, and that will look like this. So /playlist/ID. The next thing that happens then after the user clicking on that link is that the app will go to the router to find out what should I do when someone requests to see a playlist. Okay, the router line that we'll have this time will look almost the same as the previous ones we've had, but you can probably see one addition in there, and that is the inclusion of the ID. Okay, so same as before, it takes in 2 parameters. The first one is the link that's been clicked on, so playlist in this case, and the second parameter is the name of the controller that it should look for and the method in that controller that it wants to call. So that's playlist.index. But you can see here we also have the addition of this ID property. Okay, so that is going to actually take in the ID that's been passed through as part of this link. And then in the next step, we'll talk about what we'll do with that next. But you can probably guess that's going to be used to find that specific playlist that we're looking for. Okay. So next then, after adding the link and the root, we're also going to add a new controller, and that controller will be called playlist.js. In terms of the code that we have here, it's very similar to the other code for our other controllers that you've seen so far. So you'll see things here like the logger being imported and the playlist store, the playlist object being created, and an index method that will create the view data object that will pass through whatever information we want to send. In this case, it's just the title so far, but we'll be adding the playlist in a second. And lastly, we're rendering it to the playlist view and passing through the view data object, and we're exporting the playlist controller as well so that it can be used in the router and in other places too. Okay, so that's kind of the basic start of our playlist controller. But next then we need to actually get the playlist that we're looking for. Okay, so here we're going to be extracting the ID that we passed through in the root. Like I just showed you a second ago there, in the root file, we are passing through this ID parameter, which will contain the actual ID of the playlist. So 01 if I've clicked on playlist 1 and so on. So down here then in our controller, we can use this request.params to get any parameters that have come through as part of that route. Okay, so request.params.id will get this ID here. This name here, ID, should match what you have here as well. So that's important. If you were to rename this playlist ID or even ID with an uppercase I or something, you need to make that match here as well. Okay, so here we're getting that ID and we're saving it into this parameter, this variable called playlist ID. Okay. Next then we're going to use that playlist ID to actually get the playlist that we're looking for. So we're adding in a couple of pieces here. One, which is just a logger line that will show that playlist ID. So this is just a way for us to confirm by a little note in the log that it should say, for example, if we've clicked on playlist 01, it should say playlist ID equals 01. So it lets us confirm that we've successfully gotten the ID property out of the route that we've been passed. So that's that line, and we're also adding another line here that will call up the playlist store and call up a method that we'll add in there, which is get playlist. And in there then we're passing through the playlist ID that we just saved from the request.params ID. Okay, so here we saved the ID that came from the route. Oh, sorry, I don't know what I did there. Back away. Yeah, so here we saved the ID that came from the route, and here we're going to pass that through to the playlist store in order to get that playlist. Okay, so again, let's say if it's playlist 01 that I've clicked on, playlist store.get playlist is going to get that playlist 01 based on its ID and then store it in this playlist property here. And lastly then we are going to pass all of that information through to the playlist view, and that's in our final line here, response.render playlist. Here it's going to look for a file called playlist HBS, which we'll create as well. Okay, so just there we talked about a method in our playlist store called getPlaylist. So we'll need to add that into the playlist store as well. This method will be responsible for just getting one of the playlists. Okay, so it's going to get a playlist based on the ID that we pass in. That's the one we saved from the route. And it's going to return just that playlist. So it finds the playlist collection based on its ID. Don't worry too much about this and this function and how it works at the moment. We'll get into that a little bit more next week. But for now, you can just put it in with the syntax like that. Okay, so we'll have two methods in here now, one for getting all the playlists and another one for just getting one individual playlist. Okay, like I said, we'll also need to create a view to display our playlist, and that will look like this. Similar, I suppose, to what we had on Dashboard HBS. We're going to import a menu. We're going to also have a header that displays the playlist title. And here we're just going to make use of our list songs partial. The list songs partial, you might remember, used to be on the dashboard view, and it contains all the code to create a table with all the songs from a playlist. So that now we're going to make use of here instead, and it will create the table for just this one playlist. Okay, so that's our playlist HBS view. And lastly then, all these pieces kind of will build together to create the playlist view. So the playlist.js controller, playlist HBS, and that will pull in list songs HBS as well. Okay, and lastly, just to recap on the playlist ID, and I'll kind of follow through again, I suppose, how that works, because it's important to understand, I suppose, how this gets passed through from the view all the way to the root, to the controller, to the model, and so on. So yeah, to recap, we saw there how we create our link, and the link will contain a handlebars expression ID that'll plug in the current ID for the playlist. So playlist 01 for the first one, 02 for the second one, and so on. And you saw then the HTML output for that. So our links will actually look like this: playlist /01, playlist /02, and so on. Next then, in the router file, we'll have a link that will look like this. And in this link, we'll create a property or a parameter. And in here, we're going to name it ID as well. And this is going to capture that part of the link. So it's going to actually get the ID. I suppose capture that ID as part of this link. Okay, and then in our controller file, we can use request.params.id to get that value out of the root. Okay, so that's going to get us the ID value, and we save it into playlist ID. And then we call our playlist store.getPlaylist method with that playlist ID to get that specific playlist. And lastly, then you'll see when you are actually viewing a playlist, I'm just going to go to Glitch now to show you this. When you're viewing a playlist, you can also see the ID here in the address bar at the top as well. Okay, so you can see there at the end of my app address, I've got /playlist and / the ID as well. So so you can see it there too. So that's how that ID kind of works as it's passed through the app. Okay, the final part then I'm going to talk about in the next set of slides is delete song. As you can see here, we have this delete song button that we've introduced that should actually delete the songs when it's clicked. And there we go, it just took a second. So in the next set of slides, we're going to talk about that delete song functionality. In this final set of slides, I'm going to talk about the delete song functionality that you're going to introduce into the app this week as well. Okay, so like I just showed you there, you want to add the facility to delete a song, and it should modify the playlist by modifying the list songs partial to include a delete song button. So that'll be our first step, is adding in this delete song button into the list songs partial. And this is what it will look like once we've done that. And next then, when we click this button, we want the song to be deleted, like I just showed you there in the app. And what we're going to need to do is to be able to target the song within the playlist that we want to delete. So let's say if I'm talking about this one, Beethoven Sonatas is my first playlist, I think, and this is the third song within it. So we want to be able to target specifically the first playlist and let's say the third song, that would be this one here, within that. Okay, so we'll need to pass through the ID of the playlist and the ID of the song that we want to delete to make sure we're deleting the correct song. Okay, we'll send that through as a request to the playlist controller, and then the playlist controller should then delete the song and refresh the playlist view. So the song should then be gone and we should be brought back to the same playlist, but it should just show us our 2 songs there now instead of 3. Okay. So the steps that we'll have to do in order to do this are quite similar to the steps that we talked about for introducing a new view. There'll be a link that we'll need to introduce that we want the person to click on. And in this case, that's going to be the delete song button. Next, there'll be a new route in the routes file that will direct us to the delete song functionality within the controller. Next then, a new method in a controller. When we're creating a new view, we're going to add a whole new controller. But when it's just some functionality within an existing view, we'll just add a new method into our controller instead. Okay, so we'll add a method in here for deleting a song. That should delete the song and refresh the page as well. And we'll also add a new method in our playlist store.js file as well that will handle deleting the song. Okay. So first off then, the link in playlist HBS. So our link will look like this. Let me zoom in on that there so you can see it a bit more clearly. So this link, again, I suppose it starts off similar to the other ones that we've seen in the past with just a / playlist /. So that part is familiar. Next, then we have a few other things, and this is, I suppose, a kind of a similar idea to what we saw in the previous lecture, previous set of slides, where we were passing through the ID of the playlist. Here, we're going to pass through the ID of the playlist and also the ID of the song as well. So there's a few different things as part of this link that we're going to pass through. This link here, this part here, this handlebars expression is going to get the playlist ID. You may be wondering here about this ... / and what that means. And maybe this is something you're familiar with from, say, if you work with the command prompt to navigate around folders or something like that, but you may have come across this before. .. generally means go up a level. So that tells it to go up a level. At the moment, we're here within this list songs HBS partial. So in order for it to know what we mean when we say playlist.id, it's going to need to go back up a level out of this file and back up to the playlist HBS file instead. And up at this level, when we say playlist.title or playlist.id, it will know what that means. So that's what this part of the link means. Kind of go up one level out of this file and then get the playlist.id. So that'll be the ID of the current playlist. Next, then we have a second part. And here you could name this whatever you want, but we've named it delete song, which obviously relates to what it's going to do. So that makes sense. So delete song and then another / and an ID. And in here, because again, we're here within this playlist.songs array. So when we say ID here, it means the ID of the song. Okay, so here we're passing through the ID of the playlist and the ID of the song. Okay. And next then we'll add a matching root in the roots file. Our root again is going to contain a couple of these parameters this time. The ID one looks similar to what we saw in the last set of slides. That's going to be the ID of the playlist. And next then delete song and another / and then the ID of the song we want to delete. And you can see here these correspond to what we've passed through in the link. So this playlist ID here is going to be mapped onto this ID parameter in the router file. And this ID expression here is going to contain the ID of the song, and that's going to be mapped onto song ID in the router file. We do need to name these differently. So that's why we've gone with ID for playlist, the playlist ID, and song ID for the song ID. You could, if you want to get even more explicit here, and call this one playlist ID. But anyway, in the lab, we've done it this way. So just remember that when we say ID here, we're talking about the ID of the playlist. And when we say song ID, we're talking about the ID of the song. Okay, so that then is going to go and call the delete song method in the playlist controller, which we're going to add next. Okay, and yeah, and that's just kind of shown again that the ID of the playlist and the ID of the song is what we're passing through to the router file, and mapping those onto these properties named ID and song ID. Okay, and next then we have the delete song method, and this is going to be added into the playlist controller. Okay, you'll add this after your index method, and it will go kind of within the playlist object, but just after the index method. You'll see in the lab anyway exactly where you need to add that. And in the delete song method then, we're going to take in those two parameters that we just talked about. So that's request.params.id, which is the playlist ID, and request.params.song.id, which is the song ID. And we're saving those then into two variables called playlist ID and song ID. Okay. And next then we are going to call up our playlist store remove song method. And this one, I suppose, a little bit different to the previous one we saw, which was get playlist. Get playlist just took in one value, which was the playlist ID. But here, as you know, we need to be able to tell it the playlist that we want to delete from and the song we want to delete from that playlist as well. So this is going to take in two parameters, which are our playlist ID and our song ID. Okay, so we call playlist store remove song and pass in those two values. And the other parts here then, the logger line is just going to write this message to the log, which should say deleting song, let's say 04 from playlist 01 or whatever, filling in there the current song ID and playlist ID depending on what the user has clicked. And the last line here, this line is going to redirect the user once the song has been deleted to the playlist view. And this one is important because this brings us back to the playlist view and displays the playlist again, and obviously this time without that song that's been deleted. So here, as part of response.redirect, we pass through the playlist link and the playlist ID. And again, if I'm in playlist 1, I should expect here then that that's going to bring me back to playlist/01. And to recap that on this slide, it shows you the steps that we're including here in delete song. So that's getting the ID of the playlist, getting the ID of the song, then actually deleting the song from the playlist by calling this remove song method, and lastly refreshing the current page by redirecting to the current playlist. Okay, and so we mentioned there then the remove song method in playlist store. That's the next piece that we'll need to add. So in our playlist store JS file, we'll add in a new method called remove song. And as you see here, remove song takes in two parameters. ID refers to the playlist ID and song ID refers to the song ID, as you might guess. Okay, next then we're going to, first of all, get the playlist. Get playlist ID is what we used actually before in our previous set of slides to get one playlist based on its ID. So in other words, this step will get the playlist that we're talking about and save it into this variable called playlist. And then the next part is going to use this remove method and remove from this playlist that we've gotten from the songs array within that. So when we say playlist.songs, it's the songs array within the playlist that we got there in the previous line. And it's going to look for a matching ID based on the song ID that we're passing in here. Okay, so it'll look through and it will find the song with the matching ID and then remove that one. And after the deletion then you should see you're left with the two, assuming there were 3 to start with, you're left with the 2 songs that are remaining. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end of everything that you need to know for the lab this week. If you do have any questions on this, obviously because this is not live, you don't get to kind of ask me in person right now, but you can ask at the start of your lab, or if you have any questions in the meantime, just send a message on Slack or email, either. Okay, and just to show you again what you'll be doing in the lab this week. As a recap, we'll be restructuring the dashboard. And my app's probably going to have to wake up again here. Restructuring the dashboard so that it looks like this, so that we can now click in to a playlist to see what's in here. And we'll be adding the functionality to delete a song as well. And as an exercise, you're also going to add the functionality to delete a playlist. Okay, so I should be able to do this as well, where I click on a playlist and that gets deleted. Okay, so like I said, if you have any questions, let me know, and otherwise I will speak to you in the lab this week.